Ladies and gents, this is the moment you've been waiting for. A podcast for podcasters. This is Creating the Greatest Show, and I'm your host, Casey Cheshire. Join me as we interview podcast hosts and investigate the ingredients of a successful interview podcast. We'll talk mistakes, earned skills, powerful questions, and more. This show is sponsored by Ringmaster, completely done for you B2B podcast production. I'm so excited. It's like when you know you're about to learn so many things and have some great conversations, there's a buzz in the room. My guest today, I can't wait to introduce you to him. He is a researcher, a writer, a podcaster, of course, really on a mission to help people, leaders, organizations transform themselves and build really good, elite, and diverse teams. Can't wait to talk to him. Bit of a nerd like myself. We're going to talk podcasting, and he has many shows that he's been a part of. He's a co-founder and co-host of Cascading Leadership, the podcast, also Talent Strategy 60, a LinkedIn live show. We should totally talk about LinkedIn today. And Talent Strategy Transformation Evangelist. Love that title at Circa. Dr. Jim Kanichirayil. Welcome, sir.
Thanks for having me, Casey. It's interesting whenever somebody does that whole intro bit, I kind of get the cringes because I sound like I'm full of myself. So it's weird. It's weird hearing that stuff played back to you because I'm like, oh, I gotta change it to just ordinary guy that runs his mouth. I think that's actually the better summary title.
Guy that won't stop talking about stuff that he cares about.
Yeah. ...
It's funny, and I will say, let's talk about this too, right before we get into it, because I wrote that about you. And so people listening know you didn't say like, Casey, make sure you sing these high praises about me. So those are things that I found about you. And I actually like doing an intro with the person there because I don't know. I think sometimes we don't get enough praise, and it's good to hear how much of a badass you actually are, once in your life, every now and then. And so I actually like doing that live, but I know some podcasts do it, cold, do it, offline. I'll talk about the guests. You don't actually hear it. We just start by saying, hey buddy, what's up? What's your take on that?
It's interesting. I think when it comes to my style, when I have guests at the front end of a show, I have the guests talk about what they want to talk about and how they want to brand themselves. It's really, and it's probably my own thing where I cringe when other people say stuff about me, good or well. I mean, especially if it's like kind of braggadocious.
Yeah.
So I'd rather from an interview style perspective, I usually have the guests kind of talk about what they want to talk about. And then obviously if they're selling themselves short, I know their background. So I'm going to be like, all right, you're playing total like underdog here. Let me tell you about the stuff that you've done. And I lay into that sort of stuff so that it actually gives them the appropriate emphasis.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? So, us personally as podcasters, there's almost like an inherent humility, right? As a podcaster, because the show is about your guest and it isn't really about you. And that's why I like it, because I throw it at you. And it's funny that you have that same reaction that I would have if I was the guest.
Yeah, it's Jen Allen, who runs the Challenger podcast. She had a post recently about some of the things that she learned in her first year of podcasting. And one of the things that she mentioned that other podcasters need to think about is, if the goal for you launching a podcast is to make it about you, don't launch a podcast. Your podcast is going to be successful by and large because of two factors. One, whatever you want to talk about is interesting to you and you can talk about it at length. But two, and this is more important, it's going to have legs because of the quality of guests that you bring on to talk about the things that are interesting to you. So you have to operate with sort of a learner's mentality.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's necessarily coming from a place of humility, because I'm not particularly humble, but I hate when people say stuff about me, about things that I've done or whatever, accomplishments and whatnot, it's just kind of weird. And I think that's a combination of the Gen X factor and the immigrant factor. We've been conditioned to keep our head down and mouth shut. So that's probably more related to that than any ingrained humility part of it. But Jen's comments about how do you generate or how do you create a successful podcast? It's not about you. It's about the guests, and it's about the topic that you, from the mission and vision of the show, that's why you launched. The why behind your show has to inform your interest and also how you spotlight your guests.
Man, already getting into it. We haven't even got to the first question. This is amazing. And by the way, shout out to Jen Allen, absolute badass. Had a chance to talk to her on the marketing show, and I'm just like in awe as I'm talking to her, like lucky Challenger got her and not the submarine guys or one of the other systems. I mean, she's absolutely amazing.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I binge that show and I just consume information. So podcasts are great for anybody that is just full out nerd and on all the time. I binge that show in 2 weeks, and she and I are connected on LinkedIn, and we chat back and forth about different things. But it's the show's results speak for themselves. And I think the interesting thing about that show is that when you think about the sales function in the broader world of work, it's basically a function that's under-resourced, and you basically excel as a seller based on your own effort and resources and ingenuity. So it doesn't surprise me that a podcast with one of the best known methodologies from a sales process perspective has the legs that it has, because most organizations don't invest in developing their sales process, their sales methodology, anything from an execution perspective. When you look at sales effectiveness, most organizations are, always talking about the metrics. And, personally, I think talking about metrics from a sales perspective is just dumb. Don't confuse activity with achievement. And that's what you actually do if you're just constantly focusing on the metric side of it instead of the actual execution and result side of it. So it's not surprising for any number of reasons why that Challenger Sale podcast is just phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah. And she is generous. I guess to your point, it's not necessarily the humility, maybe it's generosity, or maybe it's some conditioning that culture is sent upon us that maybe it shouldn't, right? But to Jen's point, she is just, she's very giving of attention and time. So a good host.
I mean, I think when you think about it in terms of core principles, and this is kind of off topic, but if you're thinking about what wires the most successful people in the world, they're driven by curiosity. Jen has that. They're authentic. So authenticity, kindness, and energy. And then generosity is a component of all of that stuff. It informs how you move about in the world. So your point about the generosity mindset makes a lot of sense in the context of Jen in particular, but, podcasters in general, or at least, people, podcasters in general, and anybody that leverages whatever platform that they can or that they have to get a point of view across.
Yeah. Amazing. And that, my friends, was the pre-show. So Chim, let me ask you the question where we start all of our shows, and we're already at a sprint. Pull back the curtain for us on your shows and share your most important strategy for a great interview podcast.
So, I mean, there's a lot of ground to cover there. I think if we're drilling that down into fundamental principles, you have to operate, and I'm going to constantly reference back to Jen with something that she said, which is your guests are the star of the show. So if you move forward with your podcast, tie yourself to the why behind your podcast. And then when you're looking at bringing guests on, you need to be focused on the story they want to tell, not the story that you want to tell. And I do this all the time when I reach out to potential guests and try to book them on the show. And they'll often ask me, well, what's the topic? and I'll give them a broad ass umbrella. Generally our the Cascading Leadership podcast is about helping people move their careers further faster. That's a lot of runway there. And, I say there's a number of different ways that we can tell this story, but I'm interested in finding out what your story is, because that's going to inform what we talk about. And, when you look at the execution of that from an end-to-end perspective, all of my outreach when I'm booking a show is focused on what's the story that you want to tell. Like there's some things that I want to talk about, but my stuff is not really interesting. It's how many different talent strategy nerd conversations can you have? You can only do that a couple times.
I don't know. I think you can.
I'll pepper that in here or there when I hear something from a guest,
sure.
But it starts from the beginning. So if you want a framework for a successful interview show, focus on the story that the guest wants to tell, and then live that through the entire process. For a couple of things that I learned pretty early on is that the more structure you put around the conversation, the less authentic that conversation becomes. So you want to have like big signposts. Think of it in terms of, if you're in New York and you want to get to California, you're looking for different states. How far am I from this state? How far am I from this other state? How far am I from this other state? You're not looking at the mile markers. You're going state to state because it gives you a broad runway to play in. And you might, be driving through Kansas and there's a giant ball of yarn that you see the sign for on the street. And if you're so regimented that you have everything mapped out by the mile, it's going to make for a crappy trip, because there are opportunistic areas that you want to explore that you won't, because you're so rigid in what you want to talk about. And when you're that rigid in how you script out a show, you really don't spotlight your guests, because guests are always saying something that's interesting that you're going to want to go on a rabbit trail within reason, within time constraints to talk about. And if you don't leverage that opportunity, it's kind of a waste of a guest. Because people are like infinitely interesting. So why would you pen yourself in to this little box that to get you from point A to point B? It's about the journey. It's not about like the just end result that you're trying to get to.
So I mean, it's amazing, the reflection of life in podcasting, because even, when I'm mountain climbing or something, if you make it about the summit, you're there for only 15 minutes, an hour or less, but you spent hours a day getting there. And if you make it about that one little 15-minute, you can be disappointed, right? But if it's all about the process getting there, or the journey, like you're saying, with the guest, then the whole thing's enjoyable. Even the prep calls, even the research you do beforehand.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because when I think about this, is me putting myself in a therapy chair. When I think about the things that, I guess if you're into that, no knock on anybody that does it. So don't take it that way. But it's interesting. One of the things that I always struggle with, and this is part of my wiring, is that it's always about the next goal. If I accomplish X thing, okay, I did that. What's the next thing? And what effective interviewing and effective podcasting interviews disciplines me on is, it's not about the outcome that you're trying to get to. And there's a great book about this called Chop Wood, Carry Water. It's falling in love with the process of becoming elite. It's, if you haven't read it, you should definitely get it. But, it's like you mentioned, it's a lesson about the broader world. We are conditioned from birth to talk about achieve this thing, achieve that thing, achieve this thing. I mean, you could certainly achieve all of those things, but does that mean that you actually have achieved mastery in the steps required to get there? Because it's not about achieving the thing. It's about achieving mastery in the elements that go from one step to another. So again, when you talk about being in the moment, active listening, working through the process, really paying attention to the journey, that's where the focus should be. If you're just doing it to get the episode done or get the conversation done, you're completely wasting everybody's time, including your own, because you're missing out on some phenomenal learning opportunities because you're too focused on the end result versus, the actual process and the discovery that happens. There's so much application that this teaches you, and that you can apply in anything that you do, personally or professionally.
Yeah. It's like have some rules, but be able to break them, right? Almost always we talk about ask that first question, get the audience that first question right away. But you know what? We had a fantastic topic about the intro, and it meant something, and we explored something. So it's like, look, screw it. Just explore that. If we had just cut that up, well, that's interesting, but let's go do this, right? That sort of formulaic approach. Now you're almost get scripted. Talk to me about, you mentioned this word too, and it was almost like the emphasis was on everything after it. Framework versus say scripting.
Yeah. And I'm a big framework person, and it ties back into something that you just mentioned. So I'm a big sci-fi nerd. So I have like all sorts of nonfiction books and fiction books. And I'm pointing to a couple of the books that I have from the Dune series. Yes. So highly recommended. But there's a line in the original Dune book and movie where Paul Atreides is in a fight, and it's the climactic fight with Fade Harkonnen. And Fade has him in pretty dire straits, a knife against his neck, and you hear his inner monologue, Paul's inner monologue. And the inner monologue is, "I will bend like a reed in the wind." And when you apply that to structuring your end-to-end podcast process, that flexibility point that you mentioned, you have to bend like a reed in the wind, because there's going to be something that comes up in the conversation. And if you're doing your job right, there should be several opportunities for you to freelance within a conversation. And that's where frameworks come in as a better tool to have a more engaging podcast experience than scripting. And frankly, from a scripting perspective, I just don't have the discipline or the attention to detail to just map out everything, because it's going to be a huge time suck anyways. So you have to factor that in too, is how much time do you want to spend on pure orchestration? So the operation side of a podcast versus the execution side of a podcast.
Such a interesting point about the time spent. I think I see this in myself and also guests. And when you try to perfect that soundbite, like we've maybe been conditioned for that perfection, the orchestration of the 2 minute of perfect monologue, if you can write that in advance, then I've done this where I've written like almost like a TED talk, right? I've written that speech out, it's prepped. Now I almost feel bad. I can't ad lib because I wrote it so well. Anything less than exactly what I wrote sounds not so good to me. So I get in this sort of, it's almost like driving on square wheels where it kind of freezes me up, because I want it to be perfect. And that, chasing perfection can get in the way of relationship, get in the way of traveling down a journey and a path and a sidetrack or any of these other things.
It's, one of the things that I say in a lot of different aspects of my life is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I talk about this with my sales teams, and I talk about it with clients. I talk about it all the time. And that's a trap that you can fall into, because it's the same trap that people fall into when they're looking to solve a problem. And in their effort to solve the problem, they're researching the hell out of the problem, but never actually executing. So you learn the most through execution and failure. Yeah. So if you spend all of your time in, machining the process or machining the framework or machining whatever it is from a theory perspective, you never get to the doing. And, I consider myself sort of lucky in that I can operate in theory better than most. But I love the execution. And that's a great balance to have, because I have enough operations to give myself runway, but I'm not going to suffer from, analysis paralysis. Like at some point, if I have a good enough idea, I need to roll dice and see what happens. The podcast journey and the LinkedIn Live show journey is a perfect example. I basically spun up this podcast. I launched in February. The Cascading Leadership podcast I launched in February, doing probably a week and a half of research and then just putting stuff into place and going. And I had some great bits of advice here and there from people like Andy Paul, who said, hey, when you're looking at releasing your podcast, you want to make sure that you have several episodes banked, because people are going to want to binge your show. I'd never heard that. So that delayed it a little bit. My thought process was, well, we just record and release. And Andy's advice way in the beginning, and he doesn't know me from anybody, I just actually promote his book, Sell Without Selling Out, which is a great book. I would recommend anybody to get that.
Nice.
He's got a great podcast too. He doesn't know me from anybody, but he offered that advice, and that informed kind of the go forward direction. But that was spun up in 2 weeks. The LinkedIn Live show, I started thinking about, okay, what are the problems that I typically see that HR or talent strategy leaders have, and how can we leverage community intelligence to help them get through that? Because we know in economically uncertain times, HR as a function gets slashed from a resources perspective. So how can we actually feed information to them that in a practical way can help those practitioners advance the initiatives that they have? That was spun up over a weekend. So if I was the type of person, or if you're the type of person that just gets mired in the details and the pursuit of perfection, you're going to have a hard time executing and delivering anything of value, because it's never going to be good enough. And frankly, no matter how good you get, Andy has, 1,000 episodes or some ridiculous number like that on his show. And, he's focused on, let's just deliver the content, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And I think that's a good enough is good enough.
Yeah.
That's really that all of that I just said, good enough 9 times out of 10 is good enough.
Yeah. Good enough. I think that's what's really opened the floodgates for podcasting, is that you don't need you can go crazy on microphones. You can go crazy on cameras. You can knock yourself out. You can always take it to the next level, but in the end, good enough. Get started. Now I want to dive more into LinkedIn Live. Any traps, any things that were happening, any lessons learned from that, any best practices around it? How is it like a podcast? Is it the same? Is it different? All those kind of things.
So I think one of the things, so it's a new show, so I don't know how much I've actually learned in context, but I actually talk regularly to Nick Thickett and Morgan of the B2B Power Hour. They are the ones that actually gave me the cliff notes to launch the show.
Cool.
So definitely check out their show. But what's interesting about the LinkedIn Live format versus a podcast is that it's friggin' live. So in a podcast, you have the luxury of, let me think through my answer. And, we can edit that out on the back end.
Sure.
And, that creates some security for a lot of people. I even do that on my own show where, hey, I'll introduce show notes and say, hey, quick show note, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. How do you feel about what we've covered so far? And we can do that on the fly. With LinkedIn Live, I think it's a little bit more restrictive, because you don't have the luxury of going off on as many tangents as you'd like to in the course of a conversation. And for somebody like me, where I'll hear something, like every show that I do, I have 2 pages of notes that are follow-ups. And sure. LinkedIn Live as a format is difficult to do that in. It's even more challenging in that format, because my LinkedIn Live show is purely panel driven. And I'm doing a combination. One of the things that I started thinking about with the Cascading Leadership Show is that as I have guests, let me break them down thematically and then have a capstone podcast recording.
Right.
That became like herding cats. So I was like, okay,
Really?
well, yeah, because it was tough to coordinate all of those schedules. So the plus on LinkedIn is that if you're looking at doing a panel conversation or panel format conversation, it's easier to coordinate for some reason than it would be on a podcast. The gap on the LinkedIn Live component is that you don't have as much room to freelance. And ours is a 60-minute show. So it's a 60-minute substantive conversation. Like this Friday, we have, I don't know when this is going to air, but the most recent or the upcoming show that we have is Equity for Women in Business, the Road to Achieving Parity. So cool. It's on a topic of gender equity from a pay perspective and promotion perspective. And we have a panel discussion on that. So it's tightly structured on a topic. And then the panelists are able to give practical advice of how they did it. But it has some restrictions. So if your guests, you have to pick guests differently for a live format than you do for a podcast. Podcasts are a lot more forgiving because if you have guests that tend to be more skewed toward the extroversion or methodical communication style perspective,
yeah,
podcasting allows you to build that in. That guest may not be as effective on a live show because they're gonna be deliberate in their communication style and the pacing for a live show. It's almost like you have to jab and counterpunch all the time. And you can't like tee up power shots on a live show just because you don't have the bandwidth to run that through.
Tell me about that. You can't tee up power shots. What does that mean?
So let's play this out.
Yeah.
So you just asked me that question. If we're doing that live, and if I'm the type of person that isn't, rapid fire in my responses, you're going to need time to think and process that answer. Like 15 to 30 seconds of thinking time is an eternity in a live format.
Oh yeah.
So when I'm saying like 5 seconds is an eternity in my brain. But those guests who need time to think about an answer, which is a great way to go through life. It's not going to play well on a LinkedIn Live format. Now, I've kind of offset that deliberately by having those things in a panel format. So now if we do the orchestration in the back end where we'll have sort of the frameworks displayed and who's talking about the topic and then who will be up next. So it's teed up that way to make it easier. Mm-hmm. But, thankfully all of our guests have been able to navigate that. But I think if you were talking about, there's more orchestration on the LinkedIn Live stuff necessary than the podcast stuff, because you don't have the room for error in a live show that you would on a podcast.
Yeah. And I have heard a sneaky rumor that not all LinkedIn Lives are live. Apparently you can record it and then make people think it's live. Because I once texted a friend, I'm like, dude, I love you. You're on this thing. He's like, yeah, I recorded that last week.
So it's that actually gives some flexibility. So one of the things that I've done from the LinkedIn Live show for Talent Strategy 60 is our shows air, our main show, Talent Strategy 60, from a people and process perspective, airs on Friday.
Okay.
We're actually launching another episode, which is focused on innovators and disruptors in the HR tech space, still under the Talent Strategy umbrella, but that's going to air live on Wednesdays. But it gives you so much room, especially if you use StreamYard. Shout out StreamYard. Shout out. If you use StreamYard, you can actually stream it across multiple channels, which is great. But it allows you to do a light edit on the back end after the episode is done. And then you can restream it, which is also another streaming product that I don't use. But anyway, shout outs Restream. but you can restream it as a pre-recorded episode. And what I typically do, or I try to do, is I'll rerun the live episode with some light edits on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday if it's a Friday show, so that it gets multiple audiences throughout. And you just have to be disciplined about staying active in the chat. So sometimes that there becomes a time constraint. But that's another way when you're thinking about from a marketer's perspective. I'm not a marketer. I'm a sales guy. I pretend to know marketing on LinkedIn. But it gives me another it gives me another channel to repurpose content. So I could take my content that I've done on my live show and rebroadcast it with light edits. I can take my podcast content that my podcast, obviously there's the audio component, but I post it to YouTube. I take snippets and post it to TikTok. I got to figure out YouTube Shorts. I think that's what it's called.
Shorts, yeah.
Yeah. And figure out that piece of it. But, if you have that one piece of content that you can repurpose, I can take my podcast episodes, which are video on Zoom, like we're doing right now, and broadcast that as a live episode to get a different audience that wouldn't be captured on my downloads through the podcast channel. So if you're not leveraging that sort of stuff, and I've gotten away from it just because of some bandwidth issues, but these are all different ways that you can repurpose channels to grab multiple audiences. And if you're a new show, if you're a new podcast and you have a fairly robust LinkedIn presence, why wouldn't you take advantage of broadcasting your show, your podcast, to your main audience on LinkedIn? Like, that's where my biggest network is. And I'm organically growing YouTube and TikTok and all that sort of stuff. But my biggest network is on LinkedIn. So if I'm not leveraging my podcast and exposing my LinkedIn network to it, it's a missed opportunity in driving conversations at scale. True.
I could definitely see that. I wonder about having something that's not live and calling it live, something just, I don't know. I like being able to, say like, woo, woo, like ask a dumb question and then like, oh, Casey, well, like that real interaction with the audience.
Yeah. And I think, and that's fair. I don't get too hung up on it because I always say, hey, the live shows are on this date and then it'll be rebroadcast. So so I'm pretty transparent on that front. And I think Nick and Morgan, when they were out in Boston a few weeks ago and they were doing the B2B Power Hour, they were active in the chat, but it was a pre-recorded conversation. So, I think that's manageable too. It just depends on, it's content is content. If you got good stuff, I don't really care how you deliver it. That's just my opinion.
Love it. And the panel format, it was one of my big takeaways from what you were sharing here. The panel format, helping with some guests who aren't so good at thinking on their feet, so that your guest doesn't have to just be the kind of person who can pull bullshit out of thin air, but the considered, thoughtful approach, a panel can really help with that, or a prep call or a framework like you're describing can really help that person prep their thoughts before you get in front of them.
So, I'm glad that you mentioned the prep call. So unless I'm dealing with like a known commodity, like Andy Paul, I have to release his episode. Stu Heineck, I've released his episode before. Unless I'm dealing with a known commodity, somebody who's like done this stuff before and I've seen their work. Yeah. I always do a prep call. And, I've had people reach out that I've reached out to and said, hey, do we need to do this? And I'm like, well, I haven't seen you do any sort of content in this, in any format. Like if you had a YouTube presence, I could bypass it, but part of it is to build the relationship, because you have to have a chemistry with your guest. And if you've never talked to them in sort of a live way, and I would say video is the best way. If you haven't met them in person, right? Video is the best way. There's stuff that's missed from a phone conversation. You're putting yourself at risk of having like a terrible guest experience. And that's the most important thing. You want to make sure your guest has a great experience and they're spotlighted in the right way. That's number one. That's the most important thing. And that's the thing that you shouldn't compromise on. But secondarily, once it gets done, getting produced, you don't want to spend an hour with somebody and then edit it down to like 20 minutes. That's going to suck.
Yeah.
So don't do yourself a disservice by skipping the prep call. If you've had no interaction with this person beyond LinkedIn messages or emails, you're creating a massive negative brand implication, because that, you know what, if the guest doesn't show well, that's on you.
Yeah.
That's not on the guest.
Unprepared, that's on you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've reached out to CEOs all the time, and I've had CEOs say, well, my schedule is really busy. Do we have to do a prep call? I'm like, GDR. So that's bleep, bleep, right? We have to do a prep call. I don't know what kind of show you have, but I was about to turn into full sailor mode.
We've definitely told YouTube it's not for kids. So my kids won't be watching it on YouTube Kids.
So when I get asked the question, do we have to do a prep call? My response is, goddamn right, we have to do a prep call. You're not Josh Braun. You're not Jen Allen. You're not Andy Paul. You're not Stu Heineck. I don't know who you are. You have a really interesting profile. I want to learn more about you and build that relationship so that I can spotlight you the right way. Because there's no way I'm going to do that blind. And maybe that's my sales conditioning getting to me. I would never do a sales call without doing some sort of research on the company and the prospect. And there's no way that I'm going to broadcast, my name behind, some production where the guest is completely like floundering. That's on me.
Right.
If I make you look bad, that's terrible.
Yeah.
So I'm just not willing to compromise on that thing unless you're like a pro. Like Jeb Blunt does this stuff all the time.
Right.
Josh Braun does this stuff all the time. You can roll dice with that because they've established a brand behind that stuff. But if you're, CEO of XYZ company or VP of XYZ company, and I've never had a substantive conversation to find out what you're interested in and what you want to talk about, that's going to make for an awful show.
Yeah. And I've had the authors and some people that maybe are busy or think that they're busy, push back more or less on prep calls. And if it's more transactional in their mind, I can understand. Look, I'm going to give you the same exact presentation I gave the other 9 podcasts. So let me just come on here and we'll do this transaction. And then I'm just sort of babysitting like we're on CNN. That's not my preferred style. So I always prefer the prep call. But I think the thing that people don't get from exactly what you brought up is that either way, you're going to be having to do some rapport building. And it's either going to happen offline in the safety and comfort for both of you, or it's going to happen awkwardly in front of everyone. And even when people look at like a Joe Rogan, it's like, he didn't just hit go. He didn't do a prep call, but they were walking around the place. He's probably offering them a beer. You want some whiskey. And then the first 30 minutes are sometimes kind of flat because they're just trying to get a buzz on so that we can get comfortable with each other to actually get into it. So it's like, you're going to spend that time one way or the other. It'd be a little bit better for both of you if maybe you spent that offline.
So it's interesting. You mentioned Rogan's show. And I haven't listened to too many episodes, but he has a much longer than average format show.
Yeah. 3 hours.
Yeah. So like both my shows the recording sessions are 60 minutes. Right. And you can't build rapport on the fly in a 60-minute show. It's going to sound like crap. Yeah. And the shorter your show is, the more critical that pre-production motion becomes. Because like I recently did a recording for Polish for Adriana Wardzala. So she is based out of Poland, and she does some YouTube work in the area of sales enablement and sales training. And we had a 15-minute show. We had a 45-minute prep. And I think that's absolutely the right approach, because how do you get the right punches in a 15-minute time limit and have it be effective? So if you have a short format show, that becomes, unless you're doing a solo show, and I'm not a solo show person, or I rarely do solo episodes. unless you're doing a solo show, the shorter your episode, the more prep work that needs to go into it from an orchestration perspective, so you can keep it on brand. So it becomes trickier the shorter your show is. And again, you have to think, like, Joe Rogan represents what, 0.001% of the podcast audience. It's like the best of the best of the best. Most of us are nowhere near that same universe.
Right.
So don't go into it thinking that you can do what he does, because your listeners don't know who you are. So you need to be tight on the mechanics and the preparation. Don't over prepare, but you need to be tight on that stuff, so you're creating a good listener experience.
Love that. That's one of the most counterintuitive, best first principles of podcast preps I've ever heard, is that the shorter it is, actually the more important it is, which will sound weird to people, where it's like, what? Be on a podcast for 5 minutes. I'm going to spend more time doing the prep. And that makes absolutely no sense until you think about it, in which case it makes total sense. So with that, I love the transition. Go to the dark side for a second. What is your biggest challenge on podcasting?
Wow, that's a good question. I think from the execution side, I don't really have a ton of challenges on the guest interviews and booking side. Some of it is actually, and this is a weakness on me, because I'm good enough on operations to be dangerous, but I'm not an operations guy. So it's handling all of the mechanics from the post episode stuff. So when we're looking at, both my shows are bootstrapped. So it's just basically me and my co-host doing the grunt work in terms of post-production. But the orchestration from a scheduling perspective, that's challenging, because I got like 15 jobs, scheduling everybody, making sure everybody's tight. But really, honestly, like, if anybody's considering launching a podcast, do not do it without getting Descript, because that was a game changer in terms of my post-production delivery capabilities, because I looked at all sorts of other editing tools.
Yeah.
And if I had to like live in those things, I probably would have gotten like 5 episodes and said, screw it. I'm over, I think I'm probably at like 65 episodes at this point on the podcast.
Jeez.
And we launched in February. Wouldn't have happened without Descript, but there's still time involved where you have to do the editing process. So if you have the ability to offload that and have somebody else do it, and edit and do the post-production, that would be where I would say do it. And, I think when you look at being able to offload that, if you're a new show, you're just going to have to bite the bullet and just get stuff out, and then figure it out on the back end.
Yeah. Makes sense. Final question for you, sir. Every so many episodes, things can change and shift, and maybe take a relook at it. 50 episodes is roughly a year's worth of a weekly show. You've already surpassed that. We talk again in 50 episodes. What is your show like? What's happening? What's your big picture vision for it?
So it's interesting. That's another really good question. So here's what I learned. So originally, when we first started the Cascading Leadership Show, the intent of the show was to spotlight the journeys of senior leaders who are women, immigrants, people of color, who've risen to that level, and basically share their secrets. So it's basically the hero's journey format.
Love that.
And there's so I started, like, I consume bunch of stuff, information all over the place. Like, if I could be a comic book character, I'd be Brainiac, because he just goes through the universe and just absorbs cultural knowledge and retains it. So he's like a walking encyclopedia or what is it? Time capsule.
Yeah.
So where I was going with that, we originally launched Cascading Leadership under the hero story format of a podcast. And I followed Andy Paul. Susan Diaz was actually the one that got this on my radar. So you definitely want to follow her if you aren't already. Great marketer, is actually one of the best podcasts in Canada. So definitely recommend, checking her out. But one of the things that she mentioned in her newsletter was that after a period of time, the hero story format is going to run stale. So one of the things that I did, and this is the cardinal sin of marketing, is that, as a person, I'm interested in a lot of different things and I can speak to a lot of different things. So why not have a show that has multiple pillars across broad topics that you can bring guests on, and it will always be interesting. So rather than running a sales podcast or a marketing podcast, there's 5 or 6 different areas that are pillars of our shows. There's DEI as a pillar of our show. There's leadership effectiveness as a pillar of our show. There's sales and marketing effectiveness as pillars of our show. There's not-for-profit spotlights. That's a pillar of our show. And then there's topic elements like navigating trauma and loss, and wellness. So there's, if you have a big enough umbrella, break down the elements of that umbrella into the spokes of that umbrella and find out what your spokes are and build show topics around that. Like right now, we're wrapping up a women in technology series. We did a series of episodes on startup founders or women founders. We have sales and marketing effectiveness coming on. And that way, every month to 2 months, you have a different flavor of what you're interested in coming out. And here's where marketers are going to get irritated with that concept, because what's the advice marketers give you? If you're looking for an audience niche down, and I'm taking the opposite approach. I'm saying, look, you want to have enough product diversification where your content is always fresh to a core audience, not a micro audience, but a core audience that would be interested in. So I'm actually creating a category where my show fits in under a broader niche than the traditional understanding of what a niche show should be like. Like there's a ton of sales shows. There's a ton of marketing shows. There's not really a show that integrates DEI, technology, talent strategy, sales and marketing effectiveness. Like if I'm looking at my personal brand, that's where I intersect. So why wouldn't I build a show around it and speak to people that have interests across those areas?
And the integration is the niche.
Yeah. It's my take on it. I play a marketer on LinkedIn. I'm not a marketer, but there's so many things that I find interesting about the world. Where do I constantly play? It's at the intersection of leadership, DEI, sales, marketing, and talent strategy.
Right.
So there's a lot of runway and a lot of interesting people you can talk about that you can talk to that have things to share on that. And again, how can you create conversations at scale? How can you spotlight your guests and, present them in a way that really highlights their expertise? You'll never run out of runway with kind of like my show vision.
Right. And it allows you, like you said before, to allow your guest to speak from the position of passion and expertise and talk to what they want to talk about. You're not forcing them into a particular pillar because they can probably tie into several of them.
Yeah. I mean, a good example is that I have one of the upcoming shows. She's going to actually be headlining the series. It's a Women in Sales series. Nice. I have Wesleyan Whitaker Greer, who is the host of the Sales Transformation podcast. I think I'm hoping I'm getting her podcast right. But Wesleyan, look her up on LinkedIn. Okay. But one of the things that she's heavy into sales coaching, and she's an African-American woman who, really had a phenomenal career in scientific sales. So she's a niche within a niche. So she's a woman in sales, which is rare. She's an African-American woman in sales, which is rare. She's an African-American woman in sales who used to be in scientific sales and rose to leadership. So that's even rarer.
Yeah.
So I have
narrow,
her. Yeah. So I have her coming on my show as part of that Women in Sales series, but then we are going to be doing or thinking about, we're working on putting her on a panel with some other guests talking about not only women in sales, but equity for African-American women in the world of business. How do you build parity around that? So there's a lot of intersections that you can explore if you think about it the right way and build that into your overall show vision, the why of the show.
Man, so powerful. Mark your calendar for 50 or less episodes from now. We'll get back on here, and I can't wait to see the pillars continuing to build this house. That excites me because I found that if I don't, and sometimes I haven't devoted time to think about this, you can let that hero's journey get stale, like you're describing. And then if you lose interest, it's dangerous because then you're not as interested in the guest and they're not getting served and they're feeling that. And it's really bad. So there's like a responsibility as a host to make sure you're building something that will keep you interested.
Well, it winds back to an early part of the conversation when we were talking about, what's your key or secret to running a good interview. It's rooted in what's the story that you want to tell. This is you talking to your guests. Yeah. What is the story that you want to tell? And how does it align with your overall vision? And how can we make that work? If you operate from that space, you're never going to get bored, or it's going to be a long time before you get bored. I totally hear you. If you're doing like, I love seafood pasta. Like linguine de fruta de mar is my go-to dish. I couldn't eat that every day.
True.
I could eat it every day for probably like a month and a half.
Yeah.
But if I had to do that for a year, yeah. So it's the same principle. No matter how good one thing is, you can't do that for the rest of your life. So build in ways to keep yourself engaged and you never get bored with it.
And that, in my mind, gets back to more of a Joe Rogan Experience broad-based podcast versus that finite sales SDR specific super niche show, because then to your point, you don't run out if you've got that broader approach, but you still have the benefit of focusing with themes and topics.
It's interesting. I had almost the same conversation or a similar conversation with one of the guests that I'm putting on a panel for the LinkedIn Live show. And I reached out to him. He's the chief revenue officer for a tech company. And I have him, and he's one of the co-founders. But when I initially reached out, I said, hey, I'd like to have you participate in the panel. I'm not sure if you're interested in it. And he asked me what the topic was. I was like, well, if I have it my way, I would do a conversation and a panel on sales and marketing alignment as a way to accelerate revenue attainment. That's what I'm interested in. That would be a great topic for a CRO to talk about. And he's like, I've done that so many times. It's kind of boring. I don't know if I want to do that. And then I asked him, oh, what do you want to talk about? It's like, I think one of the unique things about our organization, this is in talking, is that we've gone against the tech bro culture from a startup perspective, and we've built values up front in how we build our organization. So that created a conversation where, we're having a completely different panel discussion, and it's on the topic of, if you're in the startup space, in the technology space, or even if you're accelerating growth in the technology space, the topic of the show is going to be values-led growth as a tech startup. So when you're looking at the umbrella of talent strategy, how do you lead with values, and how will a values-led motion drive growth in a tech conversation? That's a really interesting conversation. And we have 3 founders who are going to be talking about that. And that's again, what does your guest want to talk about?
Right. If you had forced him to talk about what you had, your initial idea, he can talk about it, but you're going to get that. But I bet you he's going to be the whole panel is going to be on fire when they're talking about this topic, because they give a shit.
Yeah. And that's the basis. Like, if I'm going to give any secret, and I don't know anything, the one thing that I would say that everybody needs to keep in mind is be be ridiculously, obsessively focused on what does your guest want to talk about.
Yeah.
You start your podcast with that question, and it'll never serve you wrong. Now, obviously, if your show is about marketing and your guest wants to talk about Area 51, there's obviously like things that don't line up. But tell the story your guest wants to tell, not the story that you want to tell.
Boom. And then that's how you get that excitement. Man, this has been so much fun. Before I let you go, before we start closing some things down, you mentioned sci-fi. I can't help it. I'm a nerd. Favorite sci-fi series or book?
Well, if we're talking, I'll combine those. So this is again intersecting the different things that you're interested in. So favorite sci-fi book series is the Dune series. And if you really want to invest some time, read it in chronological order. There's some new stuff that came out that I haven't had a chance to get to, but I'm like 15 books deep. So that can be problematic. I would highly recommend that series. If you're talking about sci-fi series from a TV perspective, something that's pretty underrated is I haven't seen this in a while. I think it's Babylon AD is a pretty underrated show.
Okay.
And they had, I think, 5 or 6 seasons of it. So that's underrated. And obviously, like if you're a Star Trek person, I'm gonna give a controversial opinion.
Oh,
my favorite, not counting Discovery, which I think is phenomenal. My favorite Star Trek series before Discovery was Deep Space Nine. I think that is hugely underrated. And I think that's actually a better series than The Next Generation. So there is your fill of sci-fi nerddom.
You're putting Deep Space Nine above The Next Generation?
Yep, I sure
Those
am.
Are fighting words. That's like
we're going to have to step outside, Casey.
Yeah, man. I grew up on TNG, but you're right. There was something cool about Deep Space Nine. I mean, if you're going to build a space station, put it next to a wormhole. Come on.
So I think the thing that I liked about Deep Space Nine, and it had a lead character that didn't look like me, but was brown.
Was that Cisco?
So
who was that?
Yeah, Cisco.
Yeah.
So had a lead character and a cast that looked more like me than any of the other series.
Okay.
So that was important, but it was about a quadrant of the Star Trek universe that was unexplored. So when I think about how I'm wired, I've always been a startup guy. I've always been an accelerating growth guy. I've always been a turnaround guy. So Undiscovered Country, another great Star Trek movie. It was about that setting and exploring the unknown unknowns. And that's what made it great. And it wasn't an episodic series. It had an overarching story arc that was being explored in the course of the conversation. So that's what made that one stand out in the Star Trek series in my mind. And that's why I ranked it higher than The Next Generation.
Definitely broke the mold, right? It wasn't like, oh no, we're going to the neutral zone. It was like, some random people coming out, like, who are these? I don't even know who these people are, and so probably gave the authors some more flexibility, the writers some more flexibility to just do wacky things, try things that maybe would have broke the mold on, one of the traditional ones.
And when you look at the antagonists in the original Next Generation series, you had the Borg, you had, the Romulans, but when you look at Deep Space Nine, you had the Breen, the Dominion, the entire arc with Odo's shape-shifting.
Yeah, the shape-shifting.
What I forgot what their species is called. But that whole arc was just so good. So anyways, nerding out. Sorry.
Nerding out. We'll put a disclaimer, put a little nerd icon disclaimer on it. But hey, I could talk about this stuff all day. For me, I think it's the Bobaverse. I don't know if you've read the Bobaverse series. And I actually listened to it on Audible. I don't know if you're a Audible guy, but Ray Porter narrated that, and he's done some great sci-fi narration. And his narration of the Bobaverse, it's a 3-part trilogy, and it's I've listened to it like 3 times at least, and it's hours of length. I love the universe, and I want to be spending time with the Bobs. So definitely one to check out.
I'll need to check that out. I wrote it down. I'm not an Audible guy, so I have to figure out how to get that wrapped into my already, 10 books deep backlog
Yeah.
of stuff.
I mean, you can read it. My wife actually just read the text, but there's something about there's different characters and they all have a different voice. And it kind of gives you a chance to hear the voices.
That might give me an excuse to check out Audible. I'm not
Get
really
that free trial going on.
Yeah, maybe.
Might get you hooked.
Yeah.
But man, where can people connect with you? They want to reach out. Tell us about the podcast, different URLs. Reach out a little
Sure.
sales consulting because we heard a little bit of that in here. Where can people connect?
So my most active channel is LinkedIn. So you can find me there. I'm posting content on a regular basis. Both Talent Strategy 60 and Cascading Leadership. That content can be found at cascadingleadership.com.
Okay.
So you'll have snippets there. You can look at the Cascading Leadership handle on YouTube and TikTok, and you can find us there. But LinkedIn is the primary channel, and then you can always go to the website or on wherever your favorite podcast player is. We have a Cascading Leadership podcast page on LinkedIn. We have Talent Strategy 60 page on LinkedIn. So I'm not difficult to find, and certainly you can find me, at Circa as well. So I'm everywhere.
Hell yeah. So we'll put all that stuff in the show notes so people can just click right on through. We make it easy for you just to click. Man, this has been fantastic. Jim, I can't thank you enough. I love when I can learn and explore topics, and I have run out of paper on both sides. I have learned so much today, the conversations about the framework, even about the intro cringes and the things that we struggle with and the themes and the pillars. All of it's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Great conversation. Looking forward to potentially getting you on the show, or probably a panel on something sales and marketing related. I think LinkedIn Live is going to be calling your name.
Hell yeah. I look forward to doing it. I'll even log in and do the chat too, just in case we record it some other time. I will be there.
Awesome.
And for those listening, if you learned something, and I freaking know you did, because I have to show it front and back, 2 pages of notes, run out of space. It looks crazy. If you look at this paper, I look like a crazy person, but I've learned so much. So if you have to share this with one other person, 9 people, 3,000, whatever, that's thought leadership, getting good information in other people's hands. Check out some sci-fi books while you're at it. Again, Jim, thanks so much for being on here.
No problem, Casey. Have a good one.
All right, everyone. This has been another crazy, cool, fun, exciting episode of Creating the Greatest Show. I will see you all next time. And next time doesn't have to be next week. Life's too short, and we have way too much to talk about. Find show notes full of takeaways, lessons, and links at creatingthegreatestshow.com. For more information on launching your own podcast or working with us to produce your existing show, come on down to the big tent at ringmaster.com. Until then, friends, whatever you do, do it with all your might. Work at it, if necessary, early and late, in season and out of season, not leaving a stone unturned and never deferring for a single hour that which can be done just as well now. P.T. Barnum.